Welcome to the Supply Chain Pioneers podcast, where we highlight industry leaders on the forefront of innovation and technology in planning, procurement, and logistics. Hosted by your supply chain pro to know, Ulf Venn.
Hi, I'm John Hansen. I have been in the high-tech and procurement world for more than 40 years. With technology and procurement and supply chain, we have to look at it as a tool. I'm talking about the technology as a tool that has to adapt to the way in which we work in the real world versus the other way around. Probably have read something I've written, they just didn't know it was me.
Supply Chain Pioneers is powered by Everstream Analytics. Everstream gives you the predictive insights and analytics to make your supply chain faster, smarter, safer, and leaner. Go to everstream.ai to book your demo today. Hello everybody and welcome to a new episode of Supply Chain Pioneers. And with me today I have John Hansen, who's a strategic advisor specialized in high-tech sales, marketing, procurement, and a Thinker 360, a top 50 thought leader. He was mentioned as a leader in procurement in 2019 and 2021. He was a two-time Ottawa finalist for Ernst & Young for Entrepreneur of the Year award, and many, many more things. So I really want to welcome John Hansen.
Thanks. It's great to be here, all. I've been looking forward to it because I have been following your Pioneers podcast. So it's an honor to be here.
Yeah, you are a true pioneer. So I'm very happy that you joined.
I just want to get something clear, though, because my kids, I turned 65 this year. I've got 4 kids who are 12, 14, 16, and 19. And I have to reassure them every now and then that I was around long after electricity was created. So I don't know how much of a pioneer I want to be in that regard, but I just thought I'd make that clear.
Yeah, but I do believe in the time that you especially also did your thought leadership, a lot of new things happen in supply chain management. And that's going to be very exciting because electricity was around, but a lot of other concepts were a big thing back then, and they still are. So that's going to be an exciting
looking
journey.
forward to it with you.
Let's start maybe with a short introduction from your side, and then we want to go through the whole thing. So maybe short introduction.
Hi, I'm John Hansen. I have been in the high-tech and procurement world for more than 40 years. It has both a practitioner and a provider. One of the most notable things I think that was accomplished, and this is what's exciting, Ulf, to your point about what's new and exciting now, isn't exactly new and exciting. Back in the late 90s, I developed a theory called strand commonality, in which seemingly unrelated data streams or events had attributes that were actually related. And being able to see those patterns were cool. So the government of Canada funded my research, and I utilized that insight to create one of the first web-based MRO platforms for the Department of National Defense using advanced self-learning algorithms and nascent AI. Now, you hear this now, and it's funny, I was talking with someone not that long ago, and the interesting point is it's almost like today, it's what was done 25 years ago. Today, now, it's become new. It's become something that, wow. And I use the analogy, it's like my teenage daughter saying to me, you got to listen to this new band me and my friends have heard about. Here, let me put on the music. And she plays the Beatles. I mean, it's like being rediscovered all over again. Yeah. But that was an interesting point. I sold that company for $12 million in 2001. And since then, lecture circuit, writing, working with both practitioners and providers. And this is just a great industry. Every day I wake up and I'm more curious than I was the day before and more energized to engage each and every day.
That your daughter understands that the Beatles are good music and tries to introduce it to you is speaking highly for her from a personal level. They're not bad.
Well, as a parent, I feel I've done the good job because she does like the Beatles. Anyway.
Yeah. Musical education, definitely an A grade student, probably A+. Okay, so I wanted to kind of, because it just lends itself in a certain way to go through a lot of steps in your career, essentially, because they just line up so perfectly. I'm pretty sure it didn't feel that way, but it kind of, there's a natural transition in everything here. So let's go back to the very beginning. How did you actually get into supply chain management at the very beginning, right? And then maybe as a follow-up a little bit already, what were some of the things you realized early about supply chain management where were you like, that's interesting and I can do something
Well, you know what?
about
It was sort of a cross-pollination. That's the best way I can describe it. I entered the high-tech world in the early 80s. And at that time, PCs were just coming on the scene. Most in IT felt there would be a passing fancy or fad, and they'd be off somewhere and we'd forget about them. But when the VisiCalc came out with the spreadsheet, which legitimized the PC, you start to see applications in ways it could work within the procurement world, within the supply chain world. It literally lent itself very, very well to serving that industry. And of course, I, above all else, outside of being a procurement professional, outside of being a high-tech professional, I'm a problem solver. And I looked at technology as a tool, and I still do, to solve problems. You are in there to solve problems, but technology is not the driver of that solution. It is an extension of your ability to address it. You need people, process, and technology. And in those early days, which ultimately led to my creation of the application, I adopted an agent-based model, which is you understanding the unique operating attributes of all different agents within and external to an enterprise. So in the procurement world, you've got internal department clients, you've got external suppliers, and you've even got the shipping and the customs on there. So I made it a point of, rather than automating and then building back from there, how do I solve the problem and then introduce automation? So, I mean, that's that cross-pollination that I'm talking about, Ulf. From a practical standpoint, the results were quite good. One of the contracts, Department of National Defense, with the manual system and this agent-based approach, within 3 months, they went from 51% next day delivery to 97%. 18 months, they went down from, and it's a collective buying group. There's many partners in there. Went down from a collective buying group of 23 down to 3. And consistently with the MRO parts, because of the dynamics there, realized over an extended 7-year period of time, cost savings of 23%. And again, the whole idea wasn't just the cost savings on that. It was supporting the IT infrastructure, critical infrastructure for the government. And ultimately, we use that same approach. I used that same approach before selling the company to do the same thing with the New York City Transit Authority. So, you know, what we're really looking at here is that we have to, I think, with technology and procurement and supply chain, we have to look at it as a tool. I'm talking about the technology as a tool that has to adapt to the way in which we work in the real world versus the other way around. And I'm concerned that we may still be making the same mistakes we made before, equation based. Let's get the technology, let's find a problem that it solves, and then push it out into the marketplace. You know, I think there's still a certain interest in doing that. But I'm gradually starting to see, again, the agent-based mindset that's starting to happen.
Yeah, that's actually an interesting point. I do believe every company has to have an identity, right, as a software provider. So, and talking about the problem you can solve is never bad. How you then specifically solve the problem, I do believe that there's more advisory needed to make that, because it's a big change management process to adopt an IT technology, right, within any environment. So you have to understand, okay, what is exactly how a company operates and how can I feed into what they already do with the limited amount of change and damage, and then how to support that change that's needed. And I don't think everybody's
and they're not. And that goes to the point I made earlier. You see, change management, much like terminology like maverick spend and all of that, it's not necessary when you solve the problem and grow out the technology afterwards. People, process, technology. The reality is I think that people are investing in technology as being a silver bullet, magic. Like, let's go back to the ERP era. When during that era, 80% of all ERP initiatives failed to deliver the results. Then you go to SaaS and software as a service. And again, software as a service was around since 2000, but it took time to get to that acceptance by the drink applications. And they're struggling. And the Deloitte survey, CPO survey, came out and said that, 70, 80% of CPOs aren't satisfied with the results of that. And now we're into AI. And it seems like there's the risk we're making the same mistake again. Gartner reported that 80%, 85% of all AI initiatives are stalling out or not delivering. So what's happening there is we're leading with technology when we should be leading with, again, a people, process, then technology model. And that's the agent-based model. I think that, but again, I talked with a number of senior executives for suppliers or solution providers, and I asked them this question. It was very interesting, the response. Have you ever taken on a client, a new customer, knowing that you didn't have the greatest opportunity for success? Or would you walk away from a sure sale if there wasn't the fit or you didn't feel it was there? And the pause was deafening. And most organizations, most solution providers are caught between that rock and a hard place. They want to solve problems. They have an original vision to serve clients. But then when you get into the financial markets, VCs, all of that, they have quarterly requirements. And so you've got these irresistible force and immovable objects coming together. And that's ultimately what has caused a lot of the initiative failures, because it takes time to problem solve. It's a lot easier to bombard with marketing messaging and everything and say, we've got this solution, buy it. And so many people will look at technology as being a silver bullet, and it's not. In and of itself, technology will not solve a problem. Technology is an extension of a solution that you implement because you understand how to solve it. And there's examples I could give with the D&D if you want me to get into it, but that's where I see history potentially repeating itself. And my biggest concern now, Ulf, is that we're going to be experiencing in 2025 another dot-com bubble burst, similar to what we did in 2000, except with AI this time. And if you've been reading some of the papers, Bloomberg and some of the financials, a lot of companies who are in this area of artificial intelligence have been downgraded from an investment standpoint. They're not hitting the numbers. They are now the realization that even with AI, organizations to get something out of it, extract it, will require more people working with them than they thought. It's almost like a repeat of what happened during the dot-com boom. There was a lot of investment going in, a lot of money going in, a lot of excitement, but too many dots on the map. And ultimately, there's only room for so many. And the ones that do stick are the ones who actually solve problems.
Yeah. No, first of all, I totally agree, right? Being a little bit maybe a devil's advocate, I would say that you have, obviously you need a certain, as a solution provider, you need a certain amount of standardization in your product. So you don't have and then you have to a certain extent have a one size fits all approach. However, if you have a concrete problem that you solve, then you can try to guide the customer in a way that he can adopt the platform and solve this problem in a smooth way. So I think that's still, you cannot just have everybody build their own
solution. No, but you know
what?
The key point, and I agree with you on that. The key point, and let me look at the D&D example. When they were struggling with meeting the contract, who were supporting them, they said, what we need to do is we need to automate procurement. This is back in the late 90s. And I looked and said, what are we automating? I came from the era of garbage in, garbage out. If you have a poor process, all technology does is speed up the poor process. So I said, wait, let's take a step back. Let's look beyond the silo of the procurement department and look at the other agents. And so I looked at the service department, and they had their own systems and objectives, and their technicians were actually compensated, judged, or assessed based on how many service calls they could make in a single day, how many sites they could get out to. Now, there was a loose policy there saying that after each service call, they should order the parts. But they looked and said, you know what, it's too long, it's too cumbersome. So they ultimately sandbagged all of those until 3, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and then did a dump on procurement. Now, the problem that created is with MRO parts, their dynamic flux. Research showed us where a part that cost $100 at 9 in the morning will cost $1,000 at 4 in the afternoon. So number one, because they were getting all the orders in the late afternoon, it shrunk their supply base. So we looked at it and said, there's problem number one. If we just automate procurement and don't take into account the fact that what service technicians, the service department is doing, all we're going to do is speed up a process that is this narrow, but we're still going to be doing it between 3 and 5 o'clock. I then looked at suppliers and customs. A lot of the suppliers were much smaller. Most of the orders that were being fulfilled for Canada were coming up from the US, which means they were border clearance. So you got smaller suppliers, not with a lot of experience, who didn't know anything about waybills, who didn't know much about filling out customs documents to get clearance. So what we did is we went to UPS and teamed up with them and created a coding, an adjunct coding, where as soon as we award a purchase to a particular supplier, we would hit the button, the PO would be generated, they would automatically get dispatched PDF purchase order and a waybill number pre-completed with all the clearance they need to get to the documents. And simultaneous to that happening, we would also notify UPS that there's a pickup to be done. So they would be dispatched automatically. So all the supplier with limited resources had to do was pick and pack the right product and then have it ready for pickup. That's an agent-based approach. Far too often the technology we're looking at today, how many consider what impact does my technology have on other departments within my company? External stakeholders, external agents, such as suppliers, such as courier, even Canada Customs is an agent. You can do everything right in your narrow scope, but you'll still miss the mark if you're not understanding how the different agents and components work together and how you adapt to be able to do that. So that's really the key. It's not the customization of a solution that everyone has this customized. And I'll go back to the basic 4 days, MAI basic 4, and the emergence of industry specific applications, because that's how that all started back in the 80s and 90s. But the reality is that you can create scalable solutions provided that it has an agent-based starting point versus an equation-based. And I think a lot of the solutions that are out there today are created and then go looking for a problem to solve versus being created to address a problem. And that's where you get into user adoption issues. That's where you get into change management and laborious tests. I mean, ask yourself this: why, over the last multiple decades, have all initiatives consistently failed 80% of the time? Why? The technology has evolved, and it is evolving. And by the way, what I'd like to say, 10 years from now, we'll look at today's technology with the same dismissive attitude. We look at floppy drives and 10 gigabyte hard drives and 2800 BPMS modems today and in the past. It isn't a technology issue. It's a problem-solving issue of people, process, and then understanding how to incorporate that technology. And if you do it that way correctly, change management is minimized. And that's really it. So that's the experience. That's over and watching. And that's the advantage of having 40-year horizon experience and seeing the same things happening.
Yeah. I don't disagree. I think for me, it's just because I come out of a world personally, right? I mean, not everybody knows it from the podcast, but I work for a supply chain risk management company. And I mean, most of these companies actually were founded between 2012 and 2014 because they were all based on the Fukushima situation back then, right? And then the supply issues generated from there. So they do address a real life issue. And I think most of them actually are doing a good job of addressing an issue. It still will need a certain amount of change management anyway, right? And it needs people to act on insights, for example, right? Because that's something that still somebody has to do, is take what is an intelligence and then act upon it. But I think it is a minimal amount of change management, but you still need to
Yeah.
talk to people about it, right? And educate them. And I'm not sure everybody does a good job with that. And that's why I think you still will always, as a solution provider, have to offer a certain amount of education around your product, even if it's and there are very straightforward products, don't get me wrong, right? I think there are amazing solutions out there that do a very straightforward job. And Gong is one that comes to mind real quick, where you get analytics about call recording and can measure sales management performance, and it's very intuitive. But still, I mean, they still have customer success managers to help people understand how to best leverage a platform and what. So what I want to say is, totally get the story. I agree. I would say the .com hype is one. I would also say crypto is another hype scenario, technology hype scenario that busted like crazy. And I agree that AI will also see a lot of struggle. And then those that really solve a problem will survive.
And that goes to your point. That goes to your point, though, about change management and whatever. The organizations who are most successful are the ones who understand that their role isn't just to deliver and implement a system. It's to understand the business and engage with that business. Because the New York City Transit Authority, for example, used a similar platform, the same platform we created. But then there were some different things we did with that because they weren't exactly the same. And you see, I think the big problem with a lot of organizations are, how do we create scalability? You know, I don't know if you remember, probably not. You're a younger guy than I am, I'm sure. But way back in 2000, the Microsoft was looking to buy SAP. And the logic was, we want to create a user interface, and user adoption is poor. So Microsoft's thinking was, well, listen, people are familiar with our Office suite. They're comfortable with our email, with our spreadsheets, etc. If we were to buy SAP, we could become that interface. Now, ultimately, it was called originally the Mendocino Project, and then became Duet. And ultimately, it was watered down, but there was never the actual purchase of SAP by Microsoft. But that tells you something. You know, we go to user experience, we go to all of these other avenues. Where is the change occurring? And how do you manage that change and minimize it? So to your point, you're absolutely right. The successful companies are problem solvers who understand how to get the most out of their technological solution and to enable the client to do that. And they look for the right clients to do it with.
Yeah. I found it very amusing that you mentioned the Microsoft thing, because I do believe for a lot of IT solutions out there, the biggest risk they face is not their competitor, but Excel.
Well, you see, now you're getting a whole different world there. I mean, you know, the spreadsheet usage. I mean, words of news of my demise are not accurate, as that famous saying goes. And I'm not quoting it exactly, but the reality is, everyone was talking about the end of spreadsheets forever. And yet they're still as strong a presence today as they were when they came out. So, you know, in fact, in some cases, they're actually on the increase. So you got to look at that. There's a technology example in simplistic form that's easy to use and adapt, despite some of its inherent shortcomings.
Okay. So we have talked a lot about digital solutions, and you helped found a lot of digital solutions, right? In a time where you build a procurement solution, in a time where Ariba and Coupa were starting.
Coupa wasn't even on the radar screen. At that point, you just had the Oracles and the SAPs and some early players. So, yeah, we were, at that point, the first entry into that realm. And, you know, I look back, and I'll be quite frank with you, I regret selling it for $12 million in 2001, because, you know, you want to get back into it, but you don't realize at the time that 20 or 30 years from now, you know, it's going to become more relevant than it was back then. We were just solving, that's the thing, we were solving a problem for our clients. And it just so happened that the technology and the understanding of how we could build the technology was able to do that. But I look back now, and all of a sudden it's like a lot of things that I was saying back then and wrote about back then are now becoming mainstream thinking. So I'm glad I lasted long enough to see that happen.
Yeah. And I mean, you used the time afterwards as well, right? So you didn't stop being around and a problem solver, because after you went from doing all of that technology stuff and working in supply chain management, before that, even in a logistics company that you led, you started to become an advisor and facilitator, right, for workshops, and shared a lot of your rich experience coming from operations, but also the technology side. And that definitely was a big pivot. I think, given that you have sold a company for $12 million, that probably was a no risk pivot you can just try out. But how was that transition for you personally?
I'll tell you something. And again, procurement and supply chain and technology are a passion. So what it was, I'm still in the area that I have the greatest amount of passion, for which I have the greatest amount of passion, but just in different means. So with practitioners and providers, I do ghostwriting for practitioners and providers, for associations. I mean, a lot of people probably read something that I have written. It just didn't come out under my name. And going the circuit, the one thing that I always wanted to do, and that's maybe where it ties it all together, is to stimulate discussion, to think differently, not to reach consensus, but to reach better understanding. And so in that, I think my greatest satisfaction post selling the company was having people come back to me and say, you know what, we never thought of it that way, but that's an interesting way of doing it. We've got to think of it that way, a different way. Or we don't agree with you. Here's why we don't agree with you. What are your thoughts? You create that zone of openness so that you can talk. That's the only way you can solve problems. And so I think that's my greatest enjoyment, even to this point in time. Although I'm coming off the bench and getting more involved with select companies to advise them from a sales standpoint and a structural problem solving standpoint, because I think there's still too much overabundance of information. I read somewhere, someone wrote that 70% of what we read or see, we forget within 24 hours. Think about that. So you've got to create discussion points that resonate, that make people think, and just keep the channel of communication and interest open. Stay curious. That's what I like about this phase of my life. Whereas with the other one, I was building a business, and quite frankly, I sold because I didn't want to deal with VCs. I didn't want to get to that point, because I remember our lawyers advising us, and nothing against VCs. I think they serve an important role. But I remember my lawyers saying, the VCs have this formula. Every 10 companies they back, they expect 7 to fail, 2 to be mediocre performers, and 1 to be the superstar. And so they're playing that 7-3-1 equation on that. And I just, again, I love the problem solving, not running the business, not being, after they took over, the company kept me on as a senior VP. I wasn't looking for employees or running a company. I just like the freedom of creating thought and solving problems.
I think that's fair, right? To say, okay, I want to do this part, and leading the company is not as interesting. I totally get that personally as well. I'm also a big problem solver. I have a follow-up question, and that just fits so perfectly, because you talked about the discourse you have with other people, right? And how that incites you to be able to have different opinions and then learn from each other and get a little bit more together. So one of the topics you picked up during that time that was emerging, and you really liked, is social media. And if there's one discourse that often isn't really going with people trying to understand each other, but rather trying to just share their opinion as loud as possible, that it's social media. So I just have to ask, how do we get to a normal conversation again?
That's a great question. I interviewed on my radio show a couple of authors. One who wrote a book. He said, the more connected we become on the social media, the less we communicate. And I think the whole thing is people are talking to each other too much, and they're all starting to sound the same. They're all starting they're blending in with each other. Social media should be building communities. You know, one of the people I don't play algorithms, for example. You know, I remember the Panda algorithm with Google and SEO, and then they got the LinkedIn algorithm. Don't tag people's names or whatever else. I don't listen to that. I just write what I believe in and reach out to people I want to engage to get some thoughts on. In other words, not enough people are building a community. They're building followers. And what you want to do is a community is where you're engaged all the time and that they're meaningful topics. So, you know, I think the big problem with social media is that people think all they have to do is put out a message, stand up on a soapbox, and say it louder or better than anyone else. And I think that's really where we've got to readjust our thinking. Social media is a ability, and I've been on LinkedIn since May 2007. Social media is an opportunity to create community of dialogue. And I don't think people look at it. People always say, oh, look how many likes I got on this. How many thumbs up? How many of those things? I would rather have 2 likes and 30 comments than 30 likes and 2 comments. The comments are a reflection of whether or not you cause someone to think. Because if you think about it, how long does it take someone to click a button of like? How long does it take them to click? Yet, how long does it take them to actually stop their life, right, and comment on it and add value to a discussion stream? So, you know, I think we've got to get out of that realm of it being another vehicle for delivering our message and being a vehicle of conversation and dialogue and community.
Yeah, also, I dabble a little bit in LinkedIn every once in a while. I started out because I was bored in COVID and I just wanted to make some videos because I needed a creative outlet. My band wasn't able to play, right, and, you know, all creativity. And I don't chase followers at all. I think I have a very small amount, but I do that with videos because I think it's the best way for me to communicate and talk about a topic that I'm passionate about, instead of going out and doing and following the algorithm. I'm pretty sure nobody can claim that I'm trying to follow the algorithm.
Well, no, looking at your podcast, I'll tell you all, and there's a sincerity of purpose that I get from your podcast. There's a sincerity of purpose. I'm not so thrilled about the video. I did 900 radio shows between 2009 and 2019. I have a face for radio. I'm not exactly what you call a great presence on camera, but that's the reality of it all. But the you know what? I get with your podcast, again, a sincerity of purpose. You're not pushing an agenda. You're opening up dialogue with people. You want to hear what they're doing, and you have a genuine interest. And I think that's the most important thing.
Yeah, I mean, it comes a little bit from me also. Some of my videos kind of went well with some of the younger generation, and then I got messages like, "Hey, I started in supply chain management because of you, and I got a heart attack." I was like, "What have I done?" And
that you've done something.
And then
you've created an influence. Somebody said, I watched what you had to say or write or do. And that's really, that's really what makes it so great. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Then I felt obligated to highlight careers of different people in a podcast like this in order to show that you have many pathways through the topic of supply chain management and can find many different options to work on something, right? And that's why I'm always trying to highlight people and their careers and what they did. And especially you did a lot of amazing stuff. And that brings me to my next topic, which is your radio show you already mentioned. You had 15,000 listeners every month for more than 11 years. And you covered so many different stories in this podcast. Can you maybe, if you pick like 3 that really stuck with you, what would these be?
The 3 that I think really stuck with me, there's a show called Undercover Boss when it first came out. And the very first episode was Waste Management CEO, Lawrence O'Donnell III. And it was aired right after the Super Bowl, the show. And so I thought, this could be an interesting interview because I often looked at procurement as being as much business as it is anything else. It's all interconnected. It's not just the buying and selling of things or the buying of things. And I reached out and he gave me an interview. One of my very first episodes had Undercover Boss on there, and the show was popular. And he, very much like you and I are talking, he talked about his history, his past, business in general. I think that was an interesting discussion. When I talked with Canada's trade minister about the Buy American controversy, it was great to have all those people come on and ask and come on. But you know what? I will tell you this, at the back end, the thing that gave me the most satisfaction, I've always believed this: you've got to respect your audience and your guests. And the best way to respect them is to know as much, if not more, about the subject matter you're going to be talking about, the guest is going to be talking about. And so what I love is when I get a guest on who has done maybe 1,000 interviews, and they'd say at the end of the show, wow, you know what? You made me think differently than I did in any other interview, or I was really engaged in that. That's really the whole thing, because that way the audience gets more. So, and the reason I started it's called podcast, but in 2009, is I realized that some people love reading blogs, but this could be an interesting medium. And of course, I've always been a fan of radio, going back to the tube days where they were big furniture pieces. And it was a way just to extend the reach of the blog, but also the subject of procurement and business in general. And it was a great journey. It happened, and you gradually started to build up an audience. And I remember some of the episodes I did where within 72 hours of the live broadcast, I'd get downloaded 35,000 times. And you'd look at that and you'd go, now there's certain advantages I had. Let's be honest. I mean, the content was good. But it was a new medium. So, it's like when TV first came out, we watched whatever was on TV because there were only so many shows on TV. But I think what was the most satisfaction to me, besides the guests' enthusiasm for being on the segment, is when the platform was called Blog Talk Radio, where they had 15,000 different radio shows going on simultaneously at the same time. And after 2 years, it was in year 2 or year 3, they said that my show had actually fallen into the top 300 of all shows across in terms of listeners. And they would actually direct guests to me that they wanted to have. So, I mean, it was a new medium, but that goes to your question, it's like social media. What are you using it for? Are you using it to sell a product? Or are you using it to just push out your agenda? Or are you actually engaging and creating interest? And I think that's really the rule is the same, no matter how advanced technologically we are. The rule is know, like, and trust. People got to know you, like you, and trust you. They've got to feel you're adding something to them. And in an overcrowded world, the only thing that stands out is the quality of the content and discussion and what they take away from it.
Yeah. No, that's great. I love that because I feel the same a lot, essentially. So for me, it's very similar. Great. So you already hinted on something that I omitted on purpose because it came a little bit later. Then while you were doing the podcast, you also started the ghostwriting. And I do not like to have redundant questions most of the time, but the ghostwriting just also lends to itself quite a bit to say, okay, what were some of the topics that you have covered that you might have never looked into otherwise, and that really you were like, okay, this was super
well, it's interesting because with all of these, I have to usually sign non-disclosure agreements, but I've written for top CEOs in the business world, Hall of Fame athletes, and entertainment people. So what I would do, and I'm not going to say it was a hobby, but I enjoy writing and listening to stories. It paid well. But I enjoyed the interviewing process because to write a book with some of these people, you have to have weekly Zoom calls with them. You have to go through chapter by chapter, each story by each story. And I think that was enjoyable because the whole idea is that you want the words that you write for them to come out as if it's from them and not written for them. And so, and it was all word of mouth business. It's interesting. I never actually ever sought to write a book or ghostwrite a book, but you do it for one, then somebody say, I know a guy. then I know a guy and I know the guy, and then you get into these circles of people. But the reward for me was the stories are incredible. And again, there's been a couple of people who aren't necessarily famous, and there's some who are very famous. And, it's funny looking at that. You become like a fly on the wall to a certain degree. You become an observer of their life, but they gain a certain amount of trust in you because they're revealing everything that's happened in their life. It was a great process. And of course, on the procurement side, organizations like Sourcing Industry Group, Procurement Foundry, I did a lot of the ghostwriting for those organizations in the past. And that's where I think one of the best advantages was understanding the market from a practical, real life standpoint that you could then add a dimension to the discussion. So magazines and whatever, I've had magazine articles, of course, under my name, but a lot of 70% of my work has been ghostwriting. And again, that's where I said at the beginning, you probably have read something I've written, just didn't know it was me.
I have anyway read something from you, actually a lot, because I look at your blog, Procurement Insights, which is my next topic. See, that was a segue. That wasn't so bad. Actually, I'm very proud of that. Yeah, unbelievable. And that this late in the day. Anyway, I cite from your homepage a little bit here. When I started Procurement Insights blog back in May 2007, I never had what you would say a grand plan. So how has that been for you? And what is Procurement Insights?
Well, it's interesting. What started me into that was my writing and having different magazines call me all the time. And somebody said to me, well, instead of trying to meet these different deadlines, create a blog. It'll be like a buffet. And, you can write about what you want to write about, as you write about on your own schedule. And I love writing. So I had no set plans that anyone would follow me. I just, hey, this is what I think. These are my experience. Take them as they are. And it grew from there. I mean, it's almost like, and again, I just this past December wrote my 2000th post. It's interesting because, I look back on it and in some ways it's gone very fast. But I never expected it to become what it is in terms of the following with it, etc. There's so many good blogs out there, and there's a few of us left, like Jason Bush with Spend Matters and Michael Lamoureux, etc. I mean, we were, Jason was probably the first with his blog, but we were all writing, and we all look back now and said, where did the years go? I would say it's, blogging was such a new thing back then. But it was a convenient way to write and share insights.
And that you did for a long time. So, and again, I would actually, if you listen to the podcast, if you look at the podcast right now on YouTube, I would really recommend checking out Procurement Insights. It's really good, actually. So now I have one more question around LinkedIn and social media. And that is, I have been stalking your profile a little bit. And I found you follow a lot of different things, but one thing that stuck out to me was one group that's called Celebritize Yourself. And they talk in their description about anyone in business can become a celebrity. Anyone from the homeless to the candy shop clerk, to the housewife, to the professor, to the entrepreneur, or to the CEO. Everybody can become a celebrity, and most of them already have. So I feel this Discord enablement, a lot of things seem to resonate already naturally for me, but maybe you share your views how that resonates.
Well, what's funny is that, and let's go back to what I said about I'd rather have 2 likes and a lot of comments. And I'm somewhat of an introvert, believe it or not. I can remember getting in front of audiences of thousands of people to give a keynote. And when they're introducing me and reading my bio, for a minute there, my head goes blank. And I say, what am I doing here? What am I going to talk about? Of course, you get up there and it's like riding a bike, as they say. But I think when you celebrate and celebritize yourself, what it really means is not looking outside of yourself for people to approve, but looking within yourself and saying, am I happy with what I'm doing? Have I done my homework? Have I dotted the I's and crossed the T? Have I been fair-minded? Am I enriching somebody else's life by what I'm writing or saying or doing? And I mean, ultimately, what caught my fancy about that is that when you look at it, somebody will say, "Oh, you want to be a celebrity?" No, what you want to be is in essence to celebrate who you are, and whether somebody knows you or not, you can toil away in obscurity. But as long as you have that internal satisfaction that what you're doing resonates, and even if it touches just one life, you've done your job. And so that's really the way I look at it. So maybe it should be reverse celebrity. I don't know, but that's the thing that interests me the most is that, am I consistently inspiring? Am I helping people to think differently? And I always live by one creed. I'd rather get it right than be right. This isn't about me. This isn't about my ideas and, oh boy, you better agree with me. Can I, through this engagement, through this exposure, can I get it right versus being right? And I think if you start on that, celebrity then becomes what you would call a more service-oriented mindset than self-serving mindset.
I love that. I'm so glad I asked this question. It was such a beautiful answer. And yeah, it should be about yourself and how you view yourself and the value you add. And yeah, great. No, I love it. So last question is always a hobby question. So you have had an amazing career. And if you look at it now, right, in hindsight, you started in technology and supply chain management. You programmed systems that supported procurement. You built your own blog. You had your podcast. You did advisory, all that things. And these are building blocks that kind of seem to make sense. So now comes the twist. As a hobby, you're a skateboarder. And I want to know, how much did each of these steps feel like a kickflip?
Well, let's go like this. I've started taking up skateboarding. I was more a runner than anything else in doing that. And the relationship between them, well, I'll go into skateboarding and shredding. My 16-year-old son's in it. And I thought, hey, that's cool. And even though I'm 65, I'm young at heart and I can still actually move fairly well. So I'm not running as much as I used to. I used to do races and everything. I had certain goals there, run 21K. And in fact, I wrote about it recently with the running, is that when I crossed the finish line, there was no crowd, no arch. There was me, the neighborhood dog, and this, okay, I ran 21K. I'm happy about that. Now, I ran races too and did very well. I'm competitive in nature, absolutely. So when I looked at this and I saw that, I went to the skateboard shop with him recently. I said, you know what? This is something I want to try. And one of the things that came back earlier, and maybe you got to overcome your fears, my son looked at me and quite honestly, he said, you're going to die doing this. And I said, no, I think, and the person in the store said to me, hey, I'm teaching a guy 62 doing it. I said, well, I'm only 65. It's that willingness to try something new. It's that willingness to go out there. So over my running career, and I still do some running, but I'm not entering in races like I used to, competitive races, it sort of segued into the skateboarding. And because it's a challenge, because it makes me feel like young, because it makes me feel like I'm not sitting on the sidelines waiting to retire. And so when I look at it, and again, standing on one for the first time, you get more comfortable with it as you do it more often. But, I think that parallels nicely with the career, because a lot of things you happen to enter into by circumstance, but you have the willingness to do something differently. You have the willingness to be able to say, I'm going to take a risk. The willingness to say, well, just because somebody said I can't do that because of my age, well, I'm going to do that. And I think that's really where it comes down to the parallels for me. It's and you may find this funny. It's like me going down a water slide not that long ago at full speed. And of course, my wife didn't tell me keep my mouth closed when I hit the bottom, so I swallowed half the pool. But you're going down there. I think back to my father, and I think back to his. When he was my age, he couldn't do those things, and a lot of people can't. So I think you have an obligation to strive to be your best at whatever you do, and that you should never retire, You should just continually be curious, continuously be willing to try new things, continue to take risks. And that's what enriches life the most. Always be curious.
That's the most important thing. Okay, so John, first of all, this was a pleasure. I loved it. And we never talked before, frankly, right? Full transparency, never talked before, but we kind of talked before on social media, so we already got to know each other a little bit. I thoroughly enjoyed this today, I have to say. It was a great presentation. I hope you liked it as well, and maybe you come back.
I would be very happy to, and I have to say, you reminded me of me when I first started doing podcasts. Your research, your history, the thoroughness, but the integrity and sincerity behind what you're doing, that comes across. This isn't just a platform to say, look at me. This is a platform to honestly engage not only your guests, but your audience. So I'd be very glad to come back anytime.
Good. Yeah, we often do a pre-Christmas episode, so maybe that could be a thing. Thank you so much. And for everybody who's still here and listens to us, John, you want to tell them where they can find you?
Well, you know what? The best thing you can do, and this is the advantage of being around for so long, to find me, all you have to do is go into Google and type Procurement Insights. And I'm usually one of the first ones to pop up on there, and that'll lead you to my blog, a little bit of history, as well as ultimately lead you to LinkedIn. So that's probably the easiest way to do it.
I recommend following that for sure. And with that, I want to say thank you so much for being here once again. And to our listeners and watchers, I want to say bye-bye.
This was Supply Chain Pioneers. Thanks for watching, listening, or however you are enjoying this podcast. You can find Supply Chain Pioneers on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all other major podcast players, as well as on YouTube at Ulf Talk Supply Chain. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment. See you next time.